Okay. So let's go ahead and continue, all right? So I'm a little bit behind schedule, right? We'll finish by 9 o'clock? Okay. So what's new in IFRS 9 is this new concept to measure how risk changes. That concept doesn't really exist in how we do things with Basel or IAS 39, and it doesn't exist in US GAAP. So if you're doing leases or you're doing revenue, you can look at the US GAAP literature for some ideas. Leases has a few differences, but they're very clear to identify. Revenue has less differences. When it comes to IFRS 9, you cannot look at US literature because it's completely different. All right? So the idea is if it's stage 1, we work out a 12-month loss, and if it's stage 2 and 3, it's lifetime losses. And probably the best way to go through this is to go through some definitions and crunch some numbers. So unless you've done this already, this probably sounds strange. Okay? So if you haven't done this before, it will sound strange. We'll make it clear in a second. So some definitions. So the model is the expected loss is the probability of default times the loss given default times the exposure at default. Okay? Some definitions. First of all, default is not defined in IFRS. You need to define it. So there's a presumption that if you're 90 days late, it's defaulted. But what if it's from the government? You could say it's called the rebuttable presumption. You could say, well, hold on, we don't quite agree with that one. So you have to come up with your own definition of default. And I think in Pakistan, from what I understand, is the central bank is doing that for you, correct? But in other markets, the central bank doesn't do that. It's up to you as an individual bank. Now, the probability of default is the risk of default occurring, and there is probability, there are different types of probabilities. So there's one is called through the cycle, which is the probability from now till end. There's another probability, which is called point in time. What's the chance of a default in year 1, in year 2, in year 3? So in IFRS, we have to get the probability for each year. For Basel, we care about the probability for the entire life cycle. So you don't have these numbers from your prudential reporting. You got to get them, which means you have to get someone who's good at modeling and who can sit next to a computer for a long time. And then their eyes go out, right? So they have to get glasses. It's hard. It's very, very analytical driven. So point in time through the cycle. You see the difference? Through the cycle, total chance of default, beginning to end. Point in time, next year, year 2, year 3. The second one is a loss given default. Now, when you look at the probability of default, the standard is very explicit. You don't look at collateral. It's irrelevant. So you look at whatever you define default to be of happening. The loss given default is you look at collateral. So you might have a probability of default of 50%, but that particular customer might have significant cash collateral. So it's possible to be in stage 2 or stage 3, but the loss is 0. So we analyze the collateral separately. The last definition is the exposure. So if you have a loan and the balance is 0 today, should you have an expected loss provision? No. Usually when people say something really quick, the answer is wrong, right? Correct? So if the loan balance is 0 today, should you have a potential loss provision?
If the loan balance is 0.
Yeah. Come on, you're the bankers.
Loan balance is 0. Today, there is undrawn facility.
Yes. What if you have a credit card? You have a credit card, I'm sure, right? Because women love to shop, right? You have a credit card. And what happens is when you're doing well, you pay it off every month, right?
Yeah.
And when you're not doing well, what happens to the balance? It goes up and up and up, and there's a limit, and it goes over the limit. So what we need to do is model the estimated balance, not now, when you default. Because by the time the bank says, there's a problem, it's usually way late. Most of the time on overdraft facilities, by the time the bank realizes there's a problem and they cut your limit, you've gone over the limit. So this is, in IAS 39 we didn't do this, right? So now we have to model the balance tomorrow. Think about this, right? You don't do this for Basel, correct?
We do for undrawn LC to CCF.
CCF we apply it.
For Basel you do, I'm not a whiz on Basel. You do it on Basel?
We do apply CCF.
Okay.
20%.
For LCs or LGs.
But here we have to do the exposure at point of default, where Basel is through the cycle, so it might be a different calculation, I would think. I would think it's different. Okay. So, undrawn facilities, as you mentioned. It doesn't matter the balance today. If you owe 1,000 today, and it's, let's say it's a car loan, and it's an amortizing car loan, you work out the balance at point of default, which might be 500. So if it's a line of credit, it tends to go up. If it's an amortizing loan, it should go down, right? All right. So, again, IFRS 9 is point in time. Is that concept clear? Is it?
This makes sense if there is term loan or there is a car loan, where there is an repeat period of repayment.
Yes.
But in case of credit card, if I haven't borrowed anything at the year end, then why would I have built in impairment for that?
Because by the time,
There cannot be any impairment.
because by the time you go into default, statistically you will use your credit card.
But then I haven't used my credit card at year end. There is no financial asset, then why would there be an impairment?
Undrawn
Because it's called an undrawn facility.
cash.
There is no financial asset.
Correct. So you can have an impairment provision where you don't have a financial asset. Correct. Same in US GAAP. This is the same. Now, I don't think it's crazy because the argument is I give people lines of credit, and usually people use the line of credit not when they're wealthy, when there's a problem. So the argument is I have a contract now to give you line of credit for, say, 2 years. And the argument is there's a chance you may default in those 2 years. And at the point in time of your default on the current contract, what would the balance be? That's the argument. A lot of people find this difficult, but this is what they're saying. So we don't use the loan balance today. We use the expected loan balance, which may be lower, may be higher, or may be the same. It depends on the loan. Yeah. Yes. If you're a bank, there are exceptions for accounts receivable that are not from a bank. So just to be very clear, the impairment of financial assets, there are some special exemptions for trade receivables. I'll get to the exemptions in a little bit later. So right now I'm talking about a lending institution, a bank, a microfinance, those kind of organizations. All right. So point in time is clear? Yes? Okay. And it's hard to reconcile the two, so it's very difficult to reconcile Basel with IFRS. And I'm sure if I was an auditor, I'd want to try and reconcile it, right? Can you reconcile yours? Have you guys tried? You didn't try? Okay.
By the way, under Basel, generally banks here in this country are using simplified approach rather than internal rating.
Okay.
So not the internal rating method. So they don't calculate PDs the way we calculate for IFRS 9.
Got it. Got it. So core definitions. Default, not defined. The definition used is whatever you use internally. So IFRS 9 is very principle-based. Now, I think it's easier for you, from what I understand from KPMG here, is because your central bank has done it for you. The problem I have with that is one size doesn't fit all. So I'm not sure I agree with that, but that's what you've done. Because you have different banks with different types of clients and different types of products.
So we
I don't...
have a different default definition for different segment of assets.
Okay.
Corporate, commercial, retail have different default definitions.
Okay. So I don't know what those definitions are because I haven't seen them yet. Maybe you can email...
90 days.
So 90 days is the same?
30 days we create a DPD.
But for example, if you loan money to the government and you're a power company, right?
That's the same. The definition is the same. Definition is
So you still use 90 days for them, even though it's government money. Because you know with government, they pay the power companies at a particular cycle in the year, correct? See, this is how it was 5 years ago. I'm not sure it's changed. So they late, huge payment based on, is it the tax cycle? It was explained to me last time at HBL, but they don't pay. There's a certain period of the year when they have a lot of money.
It has to be approved from the federal cabinet.
Maybe that's it. There's a certain time of the year when they pay off all the bad debt, pay off all the back money.
And what happens is the central bank gives the time-to-time specific waivers not to classify those assets. So they give the specific exemptions sometimes.
Okay. So in my view, I wouldn't classify those as a default because that's a political thing. That's me. I think you would agree with that, right?
Yeah.
The same happened in the Middle East, in Oman, in Saudi, because they paid all the contractors late in construction. Same thing. They were supposed to be paid in 90 days. They were paid in 18 months. Is it here as bad as that?
Not that bad, but yes, within 1 year or maybe 360 days.
Yeah, they were 18 months in Saudi. That's pretty bad, isn't it?
Not that bad.
It's gotten better, I think, but that was after the oil prices collapsed. They kind of like tightened the reins. All right.
One question on the default. Does the standard say that there is a minimum time that would you consider that this is the default? Like I've heard the auditor saying that 90 days is the default. Is there any example on that? Like because we have some segment of assets where, like I would give an example of an agriculture loan. Agriculture has season-based crops. They don't pay generally in 90 days. So is there any possibility to rebut that?
Yes, there is, of course. And that's a very good example. So if you have agricultural sector, they pay when the crops are harvested. So 90 days is rebuttable. And so I would say in the agricultural sector, you could say at the harvest season, plus a reasonable amount of days to get the money from the exchange. So it doesn't have to be 90 days. There has to be, rebuttable means you have a very strong reason. So if a client's cash flows are linked to an annual cycle of crops, that's a really strong reason to say 90 days doesn't work for us. Or what if the crop is destroyed and you have to wait till next season? Now, I don't know. To say 1 year delay, that's a bit much, I would think. That's a bit much. So I'm not sure if you would give a rebuttable presumption for a year. I think that's a little bit much. But it doesn't have to be 90 days.
Because in our case, the auditors didn't allow us to go beyond the 90 days.
Well, that's not what the standard says.
That's what we were trying to.
Because rebuttable means you can go longer than 90 days. Because it's a maximum of 90 days. No later than. It doesn't say 90 days. It says no later. So the standard has a cap of 90.
Okay, so then you cannot go beyond 90.
Well, you can, unless you have a really strong argument. So the auditors don't like those arguments generally. So I think the only argument that they would probably accept is government money.
Yeah, sovereign. But generally the industry has demonstrated rebuttable for 90 days in agriculture.
More than 90, you mean?
Yeah, more than.
How many days did you accept?
In mortgage, because most of the banks have demonstrated 180 days as a rebuttable
Agriculture,
presumption.
180 days, but the central bank is allowed to start the provisioning from 180 days.
Yeah, that has been accepted by most of the banks.
Yeah, there is no standard for this.
Yeah, we did start from 90.
So, okay, now here's the numbers. If you could understand this example here, then the numbers should make sense, all right? So, now again, you cannot do this manually, right? Unless you have a small number of big loans. So generally, especially if it's consumer loans, and you have 250,000 loans,